Willkommen. Bienvenue, welcome. I'm the Associate Executive Director of Canada FBM 2021, who has curated this literary programming and the design of this, we can all say, awesome pavilion. We are pleased to have joining us today in the audience the Assistant Deputy Minister of Canadian Heritage, Joëlle Montminy. Bonjour. We are also honored, and I should say very, very lucky, to have today for a conversation about preserving languages and cultures, Paul Sezigwasis from Saskatoon and Aka Mochiladze from Georgia. The talk will be moderated by Ruta Steblein. Donc, sans plus tarder, I will ask them to come up on stage. Je vous souhaite une bonne séance. Have a beautiful, interesting talk, I'm sure. Merci.
Hello, bonjour. Singular plural is the motto of the guest of honor of Canada. The guest of honor of Canada. The singular and the plural is embodied by the authors and their characters that we wish to introduce to you. Paul Sezigwasis and Aka Mochiladze. Mochiladze is born in Tbilisi. Now he lives in London and is a winner of several literary awards for the best novel nomination in Georgia. For novels like Journey to Karabakh, Santa Esperanza, and Maid in Tbilisi, now published in German under the title Love and Death in Tiflis. Mochiladze studied Georgian history. For a while, he worked as a sports journalist for a daily newspaper. Aka Mochiladze is considered a multiple writer because he believes that writers don't have a style, but separate books do. His more than 20 novels can be narrated by a 19th century Georgian aristocrat or in the urban jungle slang of the 90s, as well as by Soviet propaganda spreading academics or old sweet villagers. His characters are also several. We will talk about it further on. I apologize, my English, I prepared it in French, but the two authors.
Unfortunately, my French is terrible.
And mine is worse.
Author and curator Paul Sezigwasis is a member of the Willow Tree and writes in English. He started a social media project in which he shared online photos of the various indigenous communities from the 1940s to the 70s, found in archives and in private collections. Some netizens recognized their parents or themselves. Sezigwasis collected their testimonies and he documented the history of photos and photographers. Hence, his album, Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun, portraits of everyday life in 8 indigenous communities, was born. Mr. Paul Sezigwasis, you were inspired by conversations with your mother, who was a residential school survivor. There are so many scary accounts of what happened, she said. And she gave you the advice to collect more positive stories rather than lamentable stories of the repression. What for?
I think what my mom was saying was that at the time of the Truth and Reconciliation process, which was a large, it'd take too long to explain the whole process, but it was a large process that took place across Canada a number of years ago. And my mother was one of the witnesses. And there was a lot of the awful things that had happened during the residential school years were coming out into the media. We all knew that what had happened before, but this was hitting the general media. And my mom had said, you know, despite that, our languages, our families kept together, and It's because they kept together that we are still here today, that our languages and culture are thriving, are coming back today. So I began to look for photographs that framed that and countered the sad image or the negativity that had happened. So I wanted to counter that, all that, and be positive.
The photo we see here with a young girl from the autochthon community of the Dene, kissed by a young dog, taken by Pastor Fumolo. It's also the cover photo of your book, Under the Midnight Sun. Why did you choose this photo? Can you see it perhaps? No, that's not that one, but this one you can see it here on the cover.
I think it's on here as well, at the end. There we are.
Okay.
Well, the cover is there.
Okay.
I chose that photo because it conveyed joy and humanity, which are universal values that we share. And this photo was taken in 1971, so it was a difficult time for many indigenous communities, but there's always joy and there's always a love of life. And when I posted this photo, she contacted me. She's in her 60s now, but at the time she was about 14. So it was reconnecting that photo, because that photo was in an archive and it's bringing the photo back to the person. So that's why it was selected. In terms of the cover, that was the designer who decided that, not me, but I always bow to the book designer.
Because it resumes this spirit of vitality of the indigenous.
It's resilience, it's day-to-day life, and again, I wanted to counter the idea that we are just victims of what had happened. No people want to be categorized as victims. You know, we are resilient, we're survivors, and that is about it. It's about joy, it's about pleasure, it's about day-to-day life, it's about people in the communities living their lives, and thus that ended up in the book.
It's very difficult to compare countries and languages, but your last novel, Life and Death in Tbilisi, is about the history of Georgia, and it begins at 1828. It's also the beginning of the colonization of Georgia, and colonization is also the subject of your life and your photos and the daily living of the indigenous people. What kind of effect has this rule of Russia over Georgia till nowadays?
Georgia history is very long, extremely long. It's an old country. Georgia is a next neighbor to Middle East, and you can understand that. It's very old. It's even before Greeks and so on. So if you start now about Georgia, but the main thing in Georgia, despite the long periods of history, Georgia was occupied. Georgia was part of three great empires, at least. It has also a long tradition of being a state. And Georgia has a great luck. Maybe it's not luck, but great thing in its history, it has its own alphabet, which is only Georgian, read and written only by Georgians. As our next door neighbor Armenians also, they have their own. So we have this great treasury there in Caucasus. I think that alphabet made a great thing during these hardships and the story of survival. It helped very much because Georgia has at least 15th century tradition of writing fiction. Don't think like that. You can't compare it with many things in the world, but still it was an enjoyable thing, but it was a survival thing also, because, for example, during the Russian rule, all the formal things, even the formal meetings were made in Russian. And the written formal documents, official things, even some receipts were all Russian, but speaking and writing language inside and in schools, it remained Georgian in Soviet times. In Russian times, the Georgian schools were just independent things funded by some patriotic Georgians. When Russians arrived, Georgia had already a tradition of being the Ottomans, Persians for centuries and so on. So all that, you know, you can change some tradition. You can change this clothes, garments. You can change the attitude of sitting. But when you have this alphabet and writing the verses every single day or on weekends, for example, as our kings usually do, because it was great, you know, in a Western world for nobility and chivalry writing the verses, it was quite shameful. It's not a man's business. In Georgia, we have kings and bishops who are the greatest poets. That's a strange thing. It's more Eastern, I think. So many things during this Russian rule change, and the main was misunderstanding in judge, in state, totally different things. And it was painful. It was quite painful, especially pushing on language. Because we know these nations, great nations in the West who lost their languages, it's only democracy gave them chance, for example, Welsh people, Scottish people, to return to their roots in that way of speaking their own language. And we always had that. Because we had also the alphabet, and we strengthen it with the alphabet down there, and that's it.
Georgians often know several languages and also read books in foreign languages, but hardly anyone can read Georgian books in the original. The letters alone are unique and foreign. That is also an example for singularity and plurality. How to preserve minor languages or the indigenous languages. You have the same rule of foreign language over the indigenous people.
Well, I think we certainly have a similarity in terms of the colonization. The difference would be there's a Georgian language, correct me if I'm wrong, Aka, but there's a Georgian language. When you're talking indigenous in Canada, there are 70 odd different languages. So that's...
Yes. During when the dominant nation comes in,
exactly.
It's always they are pushing everything there.
So some of those 70 languages, some like Cree has, and the language of the Inuit, Inuktitut, those languages are pretty stable and healthy, and are actually, the amount of speakers is increasing. But there are other languages that are much smaller and are down to a few speakers. So there's a difference there, and the only other difference too is we never had an alphabet. Our languages were oral. So the alphabet syllabics, which are the writing system that many of the languages used, was a fairly recent development. So the issue of standardizing the languages on paper is an ongoing thing, but orally, many of these languages are coming back, and the amount of speakers, not in my generation, but then in generation younger than me, where I live, there are schools now, there are immersion schools for Cree in the cities and on the reserve. So there is positive things happening.
Many Georgians are forced to earn a living abroad as migrants. Yourself, you're living in London. Do you take your homeland with you?
Yes, of course, but in modern times, it doesn't mean the living. Quite frankly, I share my time. I don't have the thing of all the days that you go and you are lost somewhere there in the West and never come back. Today it's a different time, and if you want to come back, you are coming back there. Even spend more times at home than there, where you are written in the papers as immigrant foreigner. So it's quite different today, but there are hundreds of thousands of people who go to West for work. And
you make
me as unemployed man, I'm more free with that, and so that's a different. But it's quite hard. The hardships are there for people who does everyday work there. Georgia, it's not highly paid work. You can know that because Germany is one of the places where all these foreigners come work
Your main characters of your novel Death and Life in Tbilisi were living in one part of their time in Netherlands,
Yes.
and sometimes it's also funny to have these two parts of one person.
Yeah, it happens. It happens in life. How to explain that? It's about sharing in your mind, being one and another. For example, you have seen it in the movies, you have read it in the books. The man is different at home and different abroad. Abroad, maybe he does hard work. He's not that proud of his everyday life. But when he returns to his homeland, he's a guy with a bag full of gifts, full of money throwing out, and so. But it's only for 2 weeks, and so it's like that. That duality. You have duality. You have to be beautiful and generous at home. Show that you are happy coming here and you're successful there. And there is the everyday routine starts and it's terrible. But you know to come back and show that you are still a guy and still stand. That's about that.
Duality, plurality is also you show some photos of people with tractor or with rock guitars. Indigenous people is forced to change, to accommodate, to appropriate modern civilizations. And what's about yourself? How can you preserve your Indian character? You aren't, after all, you don't catch your own fish anymore, do you?
I'm a bad fisherman, so no, I seldom catch fish, even when I try. But I don't. I certainly. I'm not. I can't speak for other indigenous people at all, but I can generalize, I suppose, from my perspective, that indigenous cultures have always been about change, and part of what I'm doing with this book and what other indigenous artists are doing today is showing that we're contemporary, vibrant people. We're very diverse in terms of what the tribe or nation we come from, but we have always been about change. So when you think of indigenous people, people often think of the West and feathers and war bonnets and things like that. And that's such a small aspect, and that is something you do at powwows or something. But you go to reserve, you go to urban center in Canada, you're not going to see Indian people walking around like that. That's not what we do any more than I come to Frankfurt. I don't see anyone dressed in Lederhosen or anything, or like
in Munich. We aren't in Munich. In Munich.
In Munich, yeah. Well, I'm planning to go to Munich next year. Everyone will be in Lederhosen, I'm assuming. Yes. So that's part of the thing is.
Perhaps you can show us some
Okay.
photos, and we can see. I liked very much. You can command some photos. For example,
Okay.
this one. It's great.
Yeah, this photo was taken in a place called Fort George, which is in northern Quebec. It's Cree country. It was around the time, at that time, there was a huge hydro development happening, and which was called the James Bay Hydro Project. And it was really kind of an awakening for the Cree that they had to unite to have their voice heard. So they were in negotiations, really difficult negotiations with the Quebec government at the time. But this photo is the other side of the equation, which is these four gentlemen, including the fellow with the hat and the stick. His name is Oliver Rupert. And they're a rock band called Fort George Rockers. And at the time of this photo, they were about to embark on a tour. Because the communities in James Bay are all along, James Bay is like part of Hudson Bay, so it's a huge expanse of water. It's like the sea, really. The communities are not connected by land, only in winter, because there's ice roads, but in the summer you have to go by boat. So they did a rock tour by canoe. So it's probably the only rock tour done by canoe that I know of in history. And sometimes they had to land on islands because storms would come up, and They had to be safe. But they did a rock tour by canoe, and this photo was around 1973. Oliver Rupert, the chap right in the middle there with the hat, is still around. He's still playing guitar. So they are in competition with the Rolling Stones as being the oldest rock and roll band still touring.
But with boots on plastic.
And boots and hip waders, whatever. I don't think they're still canoeing. I think they're past that stage. But
You can perhaps you can show us some photos, for example, the sun dance or.
well,
It's so great your photos.
let me tell this photo.
testimony, yes.
Yeah, okay. This photo is interesting because when I did the book, I interviewed some of the photographers. The photographer here was named John McPhee. He was 95 when I interviewed him, which would be 2017, 18 when I was working on the book. I can't remember now because time gets. But he passed shortly after I interviewed him, and he heard about this woman who's paddling the canoe. She's an Ojibwe woman called Maria Mikanak, and that's her nephew in the front of the canoe. And she built that canoe herself. She was a character because she refused to live either on the reserve or in the town. She lived on her own in the bush, and she would come into town once a month to pick up her old age security and some canned goods or other things that she couldn't find on the land, you know. And John McPhee heard about her and just happened to make sure he was at the lake when she was paddling in, and he took this photo and some other photos, and she didn't speak English. He didn't speak Ojibwe, so they communicated by sign language. And I just think it's a marvelous photo because without me talking to him and without him having these photos, we would not know her. After they spent a few hours, she paddled away back to wherever she was going, and we never heard from her again. So it's just interesting how photography captures those moments that are there just for that moment, and then unless you can get the story behind that photo, it's kind of separated from reality. So it's putting that photo into reality.
Aka Mochilatse, in your novel, in this novel published now in German, you are changing all the time the periods. Sometimes you are in the past, sometimes in nowadays times, and it's an interest for Georgia. If I was visiting Georgia when Georgia was the guest of Hannah, and it was I was astonished about this. Survival of ancient times.
Yeah. Georgia is a quite patriarchal country in some way, quite conservative. Maybe it sounds not such improper way, but it helps the past to live in a positive way, in a negative, but also in a very positive way. When we Georgians have a problem. I said it many times. We start to speak from very far, all days, because you need to explain something. That's a thing maybe we can share. To understand some things about Georgia, you can start, for example, saying that it's a simple everyday thing, and you have to explain, and you can go very far. It's like Mircea Eliade has one paragraph, very interesting. The old man is arrested by Securitate, this communist political police, and he said, "Of course I'll tell everything, but if you understand this story, I have to tell another story. And if you need to understand that story, it's exactly like about Georgia. You say something and it means nothing for you. You have this automatic understanding of the Georgian of that. But, for people from outside there, you have to explain it. When you start, it never finishes. That's about it. So you have to do this mix, like jumping in times and so on, to introduce somehow the city, explain the world you are in. That's it.
That's the reason why your novels are so rich of periods, styles, characters.
You call it rich, I call it heavy. They need to be more plain, but anyway, they need that.
You can, for you, your experience with the search for the photographers, for the persons, it was very important for your life also, I think.
Yes, it was. I began doing this, it's almost a decade ago now, 8 years ago now, and it really was about, because these photos, which are part of museums or archives, I really wanted to liberate the photo from collections and reassociate it, like you would bring a cousin back or something. Bring him back to the communities, because otherwise they're sitting in drawers in a museum, or they're maybe on the wall sometimes. But the other problem with those photos was that they were often, the information was not there, or it was wrong. Names were misspelled, places were misspelled. So it was also correcting that the legacy of that photograph. So when I would post them on social media, people would say, "That's me, that's my uncle," and then all this. And I didn't write it; the other people were writing it. They were writing the story of that photo. So suddenly, these stories that were being written by numerous people who lived in that community and knew that person. So you started to get the story, and it was marvelous, because it was like you told your part of the story, I told my part of the story, then you told your part of the story. And you get different perspectives about the same person, all sparked by that photograph, by that image. So that photograph comes back to life, and that was important for me. It was no longer part of a museum.
Comes to life. That's
that's wonderful.
that's the main problem of the author. How every with any language that is lost, a culture is also lost. How could we manage to preserve minor cultures, minor languages?
Quite frankly, I don't know that. I know that in modern times, state, if it's liberal, if it's democratic, has to care about it, but it's a small part. State sometimes does good job, but it's state's job, and state always thinks about state. If you go to the end, so maybe communities, maybe NGOs, many things have to be done. People have to be enthusiastic. For example, I read many about Welsh movement when this their language. That's wonderful. That's great thing. All people must be involved. It's just not we are 7 and speaking the language. You have tried to make 27. It's about that, I think.
And
Everybody has to be involved, because only programs never do that. If the young man doesn't want to speak that language, you have to bring them to the class, to the room, to the nature, something like that.
And what do you think about
I would concur with what Aka's saying, and also I would just add that I'm hopeful also because of technology. I know back in Canada now, people are using not just the internet, but they're using apps and other ways to keep the languages alive. And the marvelous thing about technology is that it's what the young generations are into, and that's how they grew up.
And
So they're going to learn the language more than if I'm sitting there trying to tell them, because they're going to shut off as soon as they get the idea that they're being taught. So technology is also important.
technology of publishing can help perhaps also?
yes, of course. This singularity would be useful in that way, because we all share these telephones. That's it. We can
And
put there what we want.
we need imagination.
Yes, of course.
Like the strawberry fields, you quoted in your novel. I loved your novel. It's so a great story about characters who are changing all the times, but perhaps in the end they will get one solution, one character at the end.
Yeah, it happens. It goes like that sometimes.
So I can recommend you his novel life and death in Tbilisi, and Paul Sisquasis takes us on a journey from the east coast to the west and northern coast of Canada. This book is a testament to their resilience and gives the inhabitants a personal biography of what has almost been taken away from them by the advance of colonization and the threats of their livelihoods. He has thus gives them faces that shine with joy and vitality. Thank you very much for coming and for hearing us, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Lovely. Thanks a lot.